Hello, welcome to Perception. Let's begin with a definition of perception, and we can define perception as the organization, identification, and interpretation of sensory information to understand the environment. Notice that there's an emphasis here on sensory information, but we go beyond the information provided by the senses. We now have to organize and identify and interpret the sensory information. There are different theoretical frameworks for understanding perception. One of these is the Gestalt perspective, or Gestalt Psychology. This is an interesting approach to perception, and it was championed in the early 1900s by several people, including Max Wertheimer, Kurt Koffka, and Wolfgang Kohler. The key idea behind Gestalt Psychology is this: the whole is different than the sum of the parts. Now, that's not the only approach that you could take if you want to study perception. One approach could be that you simply add up all the parts. Let's take an example of that. So one possibility would be that as you're looking at the screen, you might know that the screen is made of pixels, and we can simply sum up all the pixels by adding all the pixels together, one to the next, and summating them, concatenating them, putting them together. We could perhaps match your perception. But that's not what the Gestalt psychologists say. They say that the whole is different than the sum of the parts. To do this, they introduced what they called laws of perceptual grouping, also laws of perceptual organization. And three of them, and there are many more, but three of them we'll discuss here. One is called similarity, one is called proximity, and one is called good continuation. Let's take an example of each and in that sequence. So let's take a look first at similarity. In the lower left side of the screen, we have 36 dots, and they're organized in 6 rows and 6 columns. But not everybody would report that they're seeing 36 dots. They might say instead that we have dots here that are organized in a row-based manner. And the reason that most people would say we have a row-based manner here is very much related to the Gestalt law of similarity. That is to say that this row consists of dark dots and this row consists of light dots. Now, interestingly, this dot and this dot are as far apart from each other as this dot and that dot. So if you were just going by how close things are to one another, you would have no basis for saying that we're in rows or columns here. But most people perceive this in a row-based manner because we have similar kinds of luminances on the rows, and here's light and here's dark. Let's go to another example. Let's take the law of proximity. Here we have again 36 dots, but now most people would organize this with respect to columns. That is, it appears to be the case that we have 2 columns over here, 2 columns over here, and 2 columns over here. Notice that all of the dots here are similar to each other with respect to luminance. So we couldn't make a light-dark distinction here, but we can make a distinction based on proximity. What is near or proximal to what else? And here, the proximal information would suggest that we have a columnar organization. It didn't have to be. You could still organize this as 6 different rows. That's still a perfectly reasonable way to go, but most people don't do that. Most people would instead say that we have a columnar organization. Okay, on to our last Gestalt law for grouping, and this would be good continuation. Here, in the lower right, we have what most people would say are crossing keys. We have one that goes from the lower right to the upper left, and there appears to be a key, if you will, behind the first key, and this one is now further away from us, and it's going from the lower left to the upper right. That's one of the ways of organizing this, and it's consistent with what the Gestalt psychologists would call good continuation. Notice that we actually don't see all of the key that appears to be further away from us. It appears to be occluded in part by this other key that appears nearer to us. Yet, because of good continuation, we assume that there is a key continuing back here. Now, it wouldn't have to be that way. Another way of organizing this, rather than saying we have one key here and a second key here, is to say that we actually have 3 objects. Here's the first key that we had a moment ago, and here's some other object, almost as if it were the bottom portion of a key. And then here is a third object, which happens to be the top portion of some other key, and just by coincidence it happens to align nicely with this one. But it wouldn't have to be that we have 2 keys. We could, in fact, have 3 different objects. Here's one, here's another one, and here's the largest of them. So we have different ways of interpreting this, but the Gestalt psychologists would tell us that we use good continuation to relatively parsimoniously or economically interpret the environment. Another very interesting phenomena in perception is called the figure-ground phenomena, also known sometimes as a reversible figure phenomena. And here we have a straightforward example of this. Many people report when looking at this that they see a black cup or maybe a black vase. Other folks say when they look at this, they instead see that here we have the outline of a face, and over here on the left we have the outline of a different face, and these two are facing each other. It's almost as if these two people, shown in white, are about to kiss, and they are in front of some kind of black background. So whether you perceive this as one cup or two different faces that are about to kiss depends in part on what you think is the figure, that is to say, what is in the foreground. Are the faces in the foreground, or is the cup in the foreground? And we can have a foreground-background type of distinction. We would call this a figure-ground. Figure is the foreground, and then the word ground typically refers to that which is behind. So we have a very ambiguous figure here. There's not enough information in the stimulus itself to constrain our interpretation to just one or the other of those. Here's another example of something similar. You may have seen this before. We sometimes call this the old woman, young woman ambiguous figure. And what we can think of here is that perhaps we're looking at a relatively young woman who's looking away from us. This would be her left eye, and this is the contour of her chin, and this right here would be her ear, and she's looking away from us. This here would be her necklace. That would be the young woman. Alternatively, some people report seeing an old woman, and rather than this being the ear, this would now be the older woman's left eye, and this is the bottom of her nose, this is her mouth. What we see over here is perhaps her right eyelash. So there's nothing about the figure here that necessarily constrains our interpretation to just one of those. Those are perfectly reasonable interpretations, either as a young woman or an old woman. These are reversible figures, as is this. Here's another classic example of a reversible figure. This is called the Necker cube, and the Necker cube is also ambiguous. Some people will report that this corner is nearest to them. Others will report that this corner is nearest to them. And if you allow yourself to just enjoy that picture for a moment, you'll notice that it tends to reverse. It goes between one interpretation and the next, somewhat randomly. You can't always will it to happen. It just seems to fluctuate by itself because there's not enough information in the stimulus to constrain it to one interpretation versus another. These are reversible figures. Let's go on to another kind of perceptual phenomena, and this is called an illusory figure. Many people report in this stimulus that they see an upside-down equilateral triangle, and also that that upside-down triangle is quite a bit brighter or lighter than the background. What's really interesting is that there is no triangle here. It seems to be the case that the triangle is created by our brains. There's nothing physically there that actually is a triangle. Now, to appreciate this point, let's understand why this is an illusion. Imagine for a moment that my cursor is a light meter, and as I point my cursor, or my light meter, if you will, to different regions of the white surround, I'll be getting some level of light. We might call it 10 units of light out here. If I now point my light meter, which is my cursor, to this Pac-Man shaped black area, I would get a lower level of luminance because there are fewer photons coming off of the black area than off of the white area. And the same thing is true for this corner that we see here. But what's interesting is if I were to march my light meter across this region of space, I would get the same level of light here as I do here. And yet most people report that this looks lighter than this does. And that's an illusion. Okay? This is an illusory figure that happens to be called the Kanitsa triangle. Here's another variation on that. Some people report a compelling sense of a sphere in here. But there really is no sphere. We just have the illusion of a sphere based on the arrangement of these black thorns that appear to be coming out of the sphere. We can go further, and we can now return to the Necker cube, which was an ambiguous figure. It was one that was a reversible figure. We can now actually define a reversible figure using these illusory contours. Just as a moment ago, we could say that this corner might be nearest to us, and that corner might be nearest to us. We can also say that this corner can be nearest, or that corner can be nearest. So now we have two things going on. We have this reversing figure, and it is defined by illusory contours. So these are very interesting perceptual phenomena. Another perceptual phenomena is a so-called constancy. Let's define a perceptual constancy as the perception of an object or quality as unchanging despite changes in the proximal stimulus. You'll remember from an earlier video we talked about the distal stimulus, which is out there in the environment, and that distal stimulus will create some pattern of stimulation on our nervous system, and we call that the proximal stimulus. So in the perceptual constancy, we have an object or quality that is seen as unchanging or constant despite changes in the proximal stimulus. Now, we did mention this could be either an object or a quality. So let's take an example of each of those. Let's take as an object first this simple door. Most people will perceive this as a door, and if it begins to swing open, notice that its shape will change not only out here in the distance, in the distal stimulus, but it will change also on your retina. And here it's changing again, yet we perceive all of these as a door. You'll remember that our definition of perception included organizing and identifying and interpreting what's out there in the environment, and we're identifying all of these as doors, even though it's the case that there's considerable change in what's physically landing on your retina, the proximal stimulus. That's an example of a perceptual constancy for an object, in this case a door. But it can also be a particular quality, perhaps like a color. So let's see a perceptual constancy in the domain of color. In this picture, we have a hot air balloon that is showing these glorious colors that are relatively brighter here. And then if it were the case that we had some clouding or some shading going on out in the environment, we would get these colors over here. But most people would report, for example, this as being a blue in the balloon, and this would be a blue in the balloon. Over here we have a red region, over here we have a red region, but we would still say that this is red and this is red, even though there's been dramatic changes in the total amount of light coming to us. If we were watching the balloon as perhaps a cloud was passing by, we would have different levels of illumination on our retina, and yet we wouldn't perceive the balloon as dramatically changing color, or in fact changing color in any way. We would perceive the color as being constant, despite these fluctuations that are going on our retina. The proximal stimulus will be changing, and yet we perceive it as a constant. In this case, we're perceiving a constant color. Okay, let's then move on and try to understand how it is that we can take the information that's coming from our retina and combine it with other information that we might have about the balloon or the door or whatever it is we might be looking at. This raises the issue of top-down versus bottom-up phenomena. And let's define each of those and then connect it to perception. By the way, top-down and bottom-up phenomena will come to us at many different points in the semester. So let's begin with a definition of a top-down process. This is a knowledge-driven process. It requires information that goes beyond the stimulus. So we certainly get some information from the stimulus, but in a top-down process, we might be relying on our lifetime of knowledge that comes to us from just exploring the environment. We have long-term memories about how the environment is laid out, and that certainly contributes to our perception, this knowledge that we have, even if we're relying on knowledge that is not right in the environment right now. Okay, we can contrast top-down processes with bottom-up processes, and we can describe these as stimulus-driven processes. These rely entirely on the neural response to stimulation. So to appreciate this, let's see if we can take a specific example that has typically worked well for students. Usually I give this example in class, and I'll circle this stimulus on the left, and I'll ask the class, what is this? And almost everybody yells out that this is a 12. Then I'll circle this stimulus on the right, and I'll say, what is that? And everybody will yell out, it's a 14. And then I'll circle the stimulus in the center, and I'll say, what is that? And almost everybody yells out, it's a 13. So they would say 12, 13, 14. Then we do one more round, and I start by asking, what's the stimulus on top? Everyone yells out A. I say, what's the stimulus on the bottom? And they yell out C. And I ask, what's the stimulus again in the middle? And they yell out B. So in one context, this was a B. In another context, it was a 13. Importantly, the retinal information remains exactly the same. The bottom-up information is identical in these two different contexts. One is a vertical context containing letters. One is a horizontal context containing numbers. But the bottom-up stimulation landing on your retina is exactly the same. And yet we give two different kinds of responses. Now, let's remember what's going on here. We have a top-down influence. We have knowledge about our A's, B's, and C's. We have knowledge about letters, and this is a lifetime of knowledge for many of us. So it would make sense that we would interpret this if, in fact, we have a top-down influence on how we identify this stimulus. We identify it as a B in this letter context. Alternatively, we identify it as a 13 in this number context because we have knowledge from many, many years back about 12 and 14 being numbers and 13 being the integer that's positioned in between 12 and 14, so it makes sense. Now what's interesting also is when I ask students what this is after giving them a prompt that is a 12 or a prompt that is a 14, they could have told me instead that this was a 45. 45 is a number, just like 12 is a number, and 14 is a number, but that would not be consistent with the bottom-up information. This doesn't look like a 45. When we're in the letter context, this is a letter A, this is a letter C. The letter W is a W, but that's not consistent with what we have here on our retina. So by combining what we have on our retina with other information that we have from long, long ago, we come up to the perception of a B in some cases and the perception of a 13 in other cases. Okay, let's go into another example. And we can ask, what's this? And most people will tell us that's a tennis ball. And we can ask, what's this on the right? And most people will tell us that's a basketball. Now, what's interesting about this is that, generally speaking, we know that basketballs are quite a bit larger than tennis balls, but in this particular diagram, that happens not to be the case. Be an instance, perhaps, of size constancy. That is, although this particular tennis ball is bigger than this particular basketball on your retina, we know that in general that's not the case. So we are using some memory that we have about the way tennis balls are sized relative to basketballs. There's something else going on here, and that is that notice that the tennis ball is on the left and the basketball is on the right. So we have some identity information that includes what the ball is, either a tennis ball or a basketball, and we have some positional information, some information about location. Is the tennis ball on the left and the basketball on the right? Now, why does all of that matter? Fascinatingly, if we take a look at visual neuroscience and we look at how the brain is constructed, it turns out that information about what an object is, its identity, and where it is, its location, those occur in two different brain regions. To appreciate this point, let's take a quick schematic of the brain, and here we've got a left lateral view. So the person's eyes would be over here, and their occipital lobe is way back here, and in the occipital lobe we have projections to other brain regions. One projection is a relatively dorsal projection. There's a so-called dorsal pathway, and the action potentials that flow in this direction and the neuronal connections that flow in this dorsal direction tend to carry information about where, which is on the left, which one's on the right. That's information about location. That answers the where question. By contrast, if we went in the other direction in the fork in the road that starts here in the occipital lobe, we'd go along a more ventral path. And typically, the action potentials and the neuronal connections carry information on the ventral path that speaks to identity. What is the object? So if we go back and we look at the tennis ball on the left and the basketball on the right, we know that the information about location is generated up here, and the information about identity is generated down here. So a question arises, how do we put all that together? How do we begin to link the location information to the identity information? Those are coded in two different parts of the brain. Well, this brings us to something called the binding problem. We can define the binding problem by this question: how is neural activity from different brain regions combined to give a coherent perceptual experience? That is, how do we bind the information about location to information about identity? To address the binding problem, we have a possible solution known as neural synchrony. Can you say that with me? Neural synchrony. So it sounds like an impressive phrase, but we'll try to understand this new phrase by using a semi-familiar picture. You've seen this actually in one earlier video. As you might recall, in the earlier video, this is a plot of many different action potentials occurring over a 1 second time frame, and there might be 500 or so different action potentials recorded from a neuron. You might notice that the action potentials are occurring non-randomly. In fact, they're quite cyclical. They're forming what we would call a 10 hertz pattern. There are 10 cycles of peak and then trough across this 1 second. Now, it might be that we have neurons in a relatively dorsal region and other neurons in a relatively ventral region that are synchronizing in time. That is, it might be that although one is coding location information, that's the where pathway on the dorsal side, and one is encoding identity information, that's the what pathway on the ventral side, those two are firing in neural synchrony. So different neurons are carrying different kinds of information, but they're synchronized. It might be, for example, that the tennis ball on the left is generating a pattern of neural synchrony at 10 hertz, 10 cycles per second, in the ventral stream, and correspondingly in the dorsal stream. And then we have some idea that we have not only a tennis ball, but specifically a tennis ball on the left. There might be a different firing pattern, maybe 5 hertz or 2 hertz as some examples, corresponding to the right side of the screen and the basketball. So it might be that we have neural synchrony that helps us to link these two different portions of the brain, the dorsal pathway and the ventral pathway. That would be one of the ways to solve the binding problem. Okay, let's go on to other kinds of perceptual phenomena. One comes to us from an early thinker in the domain of perceptual psychology. This is Hermann von Helmholtz, and he was a physicist and a medical doctor. He actually made many different contributions to many different sciences, including the science of psychology and perceptual psychology. One of his key ideas was the so-called unconscious inference. We can define that as the phenomena that occurs when one's statistical knowledge of the environment alters the perception of proximal stimulation without effort on the part of the perceiver. So there's a lot going on there. Let's see if we can unpack that. First, let's start at the end by this phrase, without effort on the part of the perceiver. This is equivalent to his description of unconscious. We don't have to work to make this happen. It's happening unconsciously. Without any kind of effort, we get this kind of an inference. The phenomena that occurs when one's statistical knowledge, that is, our long-term memories that arise from our experiences moving about the world, even as an infant, as we're crawling, we're learning about how the world is laid out, what kinds of things are more common than others in our speech, what kinds of things are more common than others in the physical environment that we're moving through. All of these will alter the perception of the proximal stimulus. That's what's landing on our retina or perhaps on our eardrum. Let's take a couple of examples to try to understand the unconscious inference. So you might be familiar with this very dramatic effect where we're looking at one particular square on this checkerboard, and that's square A, and we can compare that to square B on the checkerboard. What's fascinating is that square A and square B actually have exactly the same level of light landing on your retina. So the proximal stimulation is the same. But you don't perceive it as the same. Most people perceive square A as being substantially darker than square B, even though a light meter would tell us otherwise. Now, why might it be the case that we have this illusion? Well, according to the unconscious inference, we have some idea about the statistical layout of this stimulus. We seem to see that it is on a checkerboard, which is alternatingly light then dark, light then dark. B is positioned in such a way that it should be a light square. A is positioned in such a way that it should be a dark square. And then we can also have a complicating factor. There appears to be a cylinder that's throwing a shadow, and we might want to take that into effect because we have some statistical knowledge from way back when about how shadows work. We have statistical knowledge about how checkerboards work. So all of those factors are combining unconsciously, that is without effort, to help us see what's going on here in this diagram. And it's just intriguing that we do have, in fact, the exact same level of illumination coming from A and B, but we don't perceive it that way. We make an unconscious inference, and that's influencing our perception. Here's another example. This one pertains to size rather than to lightness. In this particular case, we have what appear to be railroad tracks, and we're looking down the tracks, and there's a yellow horizontal here on the top, and a yellow horizontal here also on the bottom. Most people report that this one on top looks longer than this one. But what you might notice is that every so often these red guidelines appear in our screen, and they show us that in fact these two yellow lines are exactly the same length, but most people don't perceive it that way. Again, it's the unconscious inference working. We want to believe that what's going on in this diagram is that we have train tracks, and toward the top of the tracks we have something that's further away from us. Toward the bottom of the tracks, we have something that's nearer to us. So presumably this bottom yellow horizontal is also nearer to us, and this one is further away. Yet on our retinas, they're actually occupying exactly the same length, left to right. So for something to be so far away and generate that kind of proximal stimulus, it must be relatively larger. And this is why many people perceive this as being larger than this, even though they're physically identical. Again, the unconscious inference is working for us to generate our perceptions. It's somehow combining the information that's on our retina with statistical knowledge that we have about the environment. Okay, let's do one more example that relates to the unconscious inference. And this one comes to us from Wiki. Here's the quote: "The second card from the left," that's this one here, and this one here, "seems to be a stronger shade of pink in the top picture than in the bottom picture. In fact, they are the same color, but the brain changes its assumption about color due to the color cast of the surrounding photo. On top, we have something like an aqua cast. It's a little bit bluish-greenish. Down here, we have something more of a pink cast. If we could take a light meter and measure what's coming off of the screen right here and right here, they would be exactly the same. However, we don't perceive it that way. Again, because of some information that we're taking into account from the background here and the background here, we perceive these identical stimuli as being very, very different from each other because, one more time, of the unconscious inference. So the unconscious inference is an important principle as we try to understand our perceptions. Thanks for listening.